So Desiigner is back in the news again, and not for music this time. If you don't know him by name, you probably know his voice. He's the guy behind Panda, that 2016 song that basically took over every radio station for months. But over the last few years, his story hasn't been about hits. It's been one legal problem after another. On July 15th, police in Horry County, South Carolina, arrested him. His real name is Sidney Royal Selby III, and he's now facing a second-degree domestic violence charge, along with 3 separate counts tied to property damage. This isn't his first arrest this year either. We'll get to that part in a minute. But let's start with what actually happened that night, because the details are pretty wild. According to police reports, it started with an argument. Not even a huge one at first, just a disagreement about him taking televisions off the wall inside the home they shared in Conway. The woman involved is his girlfriend, and she's also the mother of his child. Arguments happen, obviously, but this one didn't stay verbal for long. Police say Selby grabbed 2 of her phones during the fight and smashed them with a hammer. The reason, according to what she told officers, was so she couldn't call 911. Think about that for a second. That's not just losing your temper. That's someone trying to cut off her ability to get help before things get worse. She ran. With their child in her arms, she got outside and started yelling for help. That's when things got even more chaotic. Police say Selby followed her onto a neighbor's lawn, grabbed her, and threw her to the ground. He allegedly ripped her bag off her shoulder and threw it over a fence. She managed to get away from him and made it into the neighbor's house, where she locked herself in a bathroom. But he didn't stop there. Police say Selby then took the hammer and broke several of the neighbor's front windows, apparently trying to force his way inside to get to her. He also damaged 2 vehicles parked outside, smashing windows and hitting a windshield with the hammer. At some point, he switched to using a screwdriver too, damaging even more property. By the time officers arrived, they found him walking outside the house with blood on his hand. He was taken into custody on the spot.
Rapper Desiigner allegedly assaulted the mother of his child while she was holding their baby.
He was later treated at a hospital for the injury before being booked into jail. The charges break down like this: 1 count of second-degree domestic violence and 3 counts of malicious injury, covering both personal property and what's being described as animals, though it's not Aren Sal in Cree. Totally clear from the reports what that specific charge relates to. Combined, the property damage is valued at somewhere between $2,000 and $10,000. Now here's the part that makes this whole situation harder to look past. This is not his first arrest this year. Back in March, Selby was arrested on a separate domestic violence charge involving the same woman, the mother of his child. That earlier incident reportedly started when she tried to leave him the house to go get luggage she'd left at the airport. He wouldn't let her go. Police say he grabbed her car keys right out of her pocket, then threw her to the ground. She ended up with minor scratches and some bleeding from that encounter. He was released on bond after that arrest. And now, just 4 months later, he's back in custody, this time with more serious charges attached. According to some reports, a judge set a fairly low bond, $1,500, for one of the property damage counts. But on the domestic violence charge and most of the other counts, he was reportedly being held without bond, at least as of the most recent updates. For context, under South Carolina law, second-degree domestic violence is a misdemeanor, but it's not a small one. It's used when there's moderate bodily injury or when the person has a prior domestic violence conviction in the past 10 years, or when the incident happens in front of a child, or when someone is physically blocked from calling 911 during the incident. If you notice, several of those factors line up with what's being alleged here: the presence of the child, and, the accusation that he smashed her phones specifically to stop her from calling for help. A conviction on that charge alone can carry up to 3 years in prison and a fine in the thousands of dollars, and that's before factoring in the separate property damage counts. Before we go further into his legal troubles, it's worth understanding who this guy actually is, because his rise was one of the strangest in recent rap history. Desiigner grew up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, the same neighborhood that produced names like Jay-Z and Biggie. His grandfather was actually a blues musician, a guy who went by Guitar Crusher, so music runs in the family in a real way. But Desiigner wasn't exactly polished or connected when he started out. He was just an 18-year-old with a deep, almost garbled voice, putting songs on SoundCloud and hoping something would stick. Something did. Panda was the first song he ever recorded, built around a $200 beat he'd been sitting on for a year. It started catching on locally in Brooklyn and eventually made its way to an AANDR, working with Kanye West, who was putting together what would become The Life of Pablo. Kanye heard it, liked it, and sampled a chunk of it for his own track, Father Stretch My Hands PT2. Weeks later, Desiigner was flown out to meet Kanye near LAX, and not long after that, he was signed to Kanye's label, Go OD Music, announced on stage at the Madison Square Garden listening party for The Life of Pablo. For an 18-year-old who'd been an unknown a few months earlier, that's about as fast as fame gets. Panda went on to hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, eventually getting certified multiple times platinum, and it landed him a Grammy nomination for Best Rap Song. People compared his voice and delivery to Future, which became a running conversation in hip-hop circles for a while, something Desiigner mostly brushed off in interviews. But the good music relationship didn't last. By 2019, Desiigner announced he was done with the label, saying in a video that he needed to be on his own and couldn't have anyone holding him back. In later interviews, he talked about feeling like he wasn't getting the mentorship or attention he expected when he signed, and about wanting to build his own sound instead of being defined by one song. Then the pandemic hit right as he was trying to figure out his next chapter, which by his own account made an already difficult transition even harder. That period right after Panda blew up was chaotic in its own way too. He was still a teenager with only a learner's permit, going car shopping with his SAS manager and a Def Jam rep at a BMW dealership in Manhattan, because the song itself was actually inspired by a white BMW X6 he noticed while playing Grand Theft Auto. At South by Southwest that year, he reportedly vomited in the middle of a performance and just kept going, which became one of those early stories that followed him around. His voice and delivery drew constant comparisons to the rapper Future, something that dogged him in interviews for years. He always brushed it off, saying it was just his own style and his own sound, and at one point, Future himself took a jab at fans who weren't feeling one of his own shows, calling them Desiigner fans. Since leaving Go OD Music, his output has been quieter, mixtapes and scattered singles, rather than another mainstream hit. He started his own label, LOD Records, short for Life of Desiigner, and put out a string of EPs through it, Diamonds Forever in 2023, The Hard Way in 2021, and more releases in the years since. He finally put out his first full studio album, called Itch, in August of 2025, nearly a decade after Panda first blew up. None of it came close to matching that initial wave of attention, but he kept working, mostly outside the mainstream spotlight, and that's roughly the backdrop against which his legal troubles started piling up. The most publicized incident before this year happened back in 2023 on a flight from Tokyo to Minneapolis. According to federal prosecutors, Selby exposed himself multiple times while sitting in first class on a Delta flight, and at one point was seen masturbating in his seat. Eventually, he was moved to the back of the plane, where two people traveling with him were asked to keep an eye on him for the rest of the flight. When the plane landed in Minneapolis, an FBI agent interviewed him. According to the criminal complaint, Selby said he'd found one of the flight attendants attractive, and that's part of why he behaved the way he did. He also mentioned he'd been given medication overseas after being hospitalized during a performance trip, though he told the FBI he hadn't actually taken it before the flight. The agent noted he didn't appear impaired during the interview. He was charged with a single federal misdemeanor count, indecent exposure on an aircraft, which carried a maximum of 90 days in custody and a $500 fine. Before the charges were even filed, Desiigner posted on social media saying he was ashamed of what happened, that he hadn't been doing well mentally for months, and that he was checking himself into a facility for help. He ended up pleading guilty, and the case wrapped up with 2 years of federal probation, a $5,000 fine, and a requirement to complete 120 hours of community service. He's actually still on that probation right now, which raises an obvious question about whether this new arrest could trigger some kind of violation review. After the plane incident, he did talk more openly than a lot of public figures do about struggling with his mental health, and he said publicly that he'd sought treatment. That's worth acknowledging. But it's hard to square that with what's alleged to have happened this year. 2 domestic violence arrests in 4 months, both involving the same woman, both allegedly turning physical and destructive, isn't really something you can explain away as a rough patch. It's also worth being clear here that these are still allegations at this stage. He hasn't been convicted of anything from either the March incident or the new one. The charges are based on police reports and on what the alleged victim told investigators, and none of that has been tested in a courtroom yet. That said, the level of detail in these reports, multiple 911 calls, physical evidence like the blood on his hand, damaged property spread across 2 separate homes, paints a pretty clear picture of what officers believe happened that night. For people who grew up on Panda, all of this is a strange thing to sit with. That song came out of nowhere and turned an unknown Brooklyn kid into a name everyone was talking about within a couple of months. Was rapping through gritted teeth, and it worked. It went multi-platinum. It got him a Grammy nomination and a deal with one of the biggest labels in hip-hop, built entirely off a beat he bought for $200. But the years since then haven't been kind, and a lot of that has had nothing to do with music at all. The exit from Good Music, the plane incident, and now 2 domestic violence arrests within the same year have basically taken over the narrative around him. Whatever he's working on musically these days has mostly taken a back seat to headlines like this one. As of right now, he's still in custody, according to the most recent reporting, with no bond set on the more serious charges. What happens next depends on how the case moves through the courts, whether the March case gets folded into this one or handled separately, and whether his existing federal probation gets affected by a new state-level arrest like this. As of this recording, Desiigner himself hasn't put out any public statement about this arrest, which is a contrast to how he handled the